So what are the three most important documents that you should pay attention to in any real estate closing? Well, folks, I usually will talk about what I call or I phrase as the big three. The first is your closing disclosure statement. So now a closing disclosure statement will be the name of a document that you'll have in a residential setting. In a commercial or a private setting, you'll have what's called a settlement statement. Both documents basically do the same thing. They're like an accountant's spreadsheet, and what they basically do is net the credits to debits to give the buyer a final number at the end, so that the buyer only needs to bring one check to closing or produce one wire for the closing attorney. And those funds usually are certified. So on to a closing disclosure. This document, typically there's three main pages to it. The first one is the most important. And that's going to specify what your loan amount is, what your interest rate is, what your principal and interest payments are without your escrows. It's also going to show you a breakdown of your escrow accounts, your cash to close, or your settlement charges, and then your cash to close. And that's all on the first page. It's a summary. The next 2 pages of your closing disclosure, they're going to function just like a settlement statement would. They'll show you straight expenses, and then they'll also show adjustments between you and the other side, or the buyer and the seller, to come to debits and credits and the final number. Settlement statement will do the same. It won't have the first page summary, but it will have the direct expenses and the adjustments between the buyer and the seller. And so now that's the first of the big three, as I say. The second document that I usually discuss with buyers is the promissory note, or some places will refer to it as the mortgage note. Is a contract between the borrower and the bank. It's a personal contract between the borrower and the bank, and it ties the borrower personally to the loan. This is a personal contract between the borrower and the bank. And as such, it's going to talk about all of the financing terms, or the basic financing terms, that the buyer has to comply with throughout the life of the loan. It's going to specify on the first page who the lender is, what the interest rate is, when the first payment's due, when the maturity date is, or the last payment is due, what the principal and interest payments are without the escrows. Now, once again, make sure that you check out the links that I've included in the description of this video for prior videos that will address the issues, some of the issues that I'm discussing. But back to the promissory note. It's also going to specify if there is a prepayment penalty, which is important. And basically, a prepayment penalty is a fee or a charge that the bank will charge to the buyer if the buyer refinances or gets another loan to pay off the existing loan with the lender. The lender will charge a fee for the early payment from the buyer. Now, what's the third of the big three? Well, that would be the mortgage, or the mortgage deed, as some states will say. And that's because it's a temporary transfer of the title to the bank until the loan is paid in full. Now, a mortgage in general is an instrument that's going to secure the bank against the real estate in case there's a default. The bank can foreclose on the property. So as I say to borrowers in my classes, a mortgage ties the real estate to the transaction, or ties the real estate to the loan. And it's a security instrument. So what does a mortgage contain? Well, it's going to contain some basics. It's going to name the borrower, the bank, the loan amount, the maturity date, which is the final payment. It's going to identify the real estate, and it's going to give some basic definitions in the first couple of pages. Then it's going to go on to talk about escrow accounts and how those are regulated. It'll also talk about things like maintaining the property, how the borrower has to maintain the property, how it has to be insured at all times, how the real estate taxes have to be paid, how no liens can come against the property for money that's owed for other types of loans that might be out there. It's also going to talk about things like if the borrower transfers title to the property. It's called a due on sale clause. If the borrower transfers title for any reason, the bank has the right to hold the borrower in default. It's going to spell out what the rights of the bank are. That would be called the right of acceleration, meaning the bank could pull everything forward and foreclose. And it's also going to talk about the right of reinstatement, which is the borrower's right to fix any defaults before the bank goes into foreclosure proceedings, and then the borrower can continue on the schedule. So those are the big three documents that I usually will discuss with people at any closing right at the very beginning. Because if the borrowers can understand these three documents, then they can understand the rest of the documents. Because a lot of them are just the bank covering itself, having the borrower sign affidavits meant to deal with real estate taxes and taxes in general. So that's what we usually talk about in the very beginning of every closing. Now, if you're watching me on Facebook, make sure that you subscribe in the lower right-hand corner. If you're watching me on YouTube, make sure that you like the video. And make sure that you check out the links that I have included in the description of the video, down below if you're watching me on YouTube, up above if you're watching me on Facebook usually. And make sure that you check those out just to get a full idea of what I'm discussing. Dave Cerullo, CerulloLaw.com.